But will the Russian vaccine work? I mean, it's being rushed so fast. Joining me is Professor Peter Collignon, who's an infectious diseases expert from the Australian National University. I've got to say, right through this crisis, I think Peter Collignon has called it more accurately than just about any expert I can think of. Peter Collignon, thank you so much indeed for your time. I've heard experts say that Russia here is taking a shocking gamble with people's lives, rushing through the human trials, using a lab that few people have heard of. What chance do you give this vaccine?
Well, the vaccine has a chance because it's very similar to the one being developed by Oxford. The trouble with the Russians is they haven't rushed through human trials. They've done none, or effectively none. As far as I'm aware, from what limited data is available, they may have tested it on 70 people and yet have apparently licensed it. Well, that's a real worry. First of all, you've got to do these phase 3 trials, which is where you enroll tens of thousands of people, both to make sure it's safe in all age groups you might want to give it to, but also does it work? Because you've got to remember some of the early coronavirus vaccines or even the SARS vaccine, when tested in animals, not only didn't they protect people, they increased your risk of getting an infection. So there's a lot of studies that really need to be done on at least tens of thousands of people before you roll it out to tens of millions of people and potentially billions of people. Because if you screw this up because you've done it properly and not done the proper safety and efficacy studies, if and when we get a vaccine that works, you might find a lot of people are reticent to take it up because they've heard of the disaster somewhere else because those trials weren't done properly. So I think this is a really bad mistake to basically ignore what is fundamental science and data you need before you roll this out to tens of millions of people.
That is, look, I agree with you. This is amazing. What could go wrong is people, of course, getting killed by this thing. Why do you think the rush?
Well, I think there's a rush because everybody's already sick of COVID. I mean, it interferes with everything we want to do. It, obviously kills people, admittedly older people more than young people, but nobody wants this. This is 10 or 20 times worse than seasonal influenza. So, and in fact, the silver bullet, if you like, is a vaccine that's 90% effective, that is widely distributed so we can go back to life. We can travel overseas. We don't have to worry. We, don't have to, physical distance, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the reality. Even if we get a vaccine, and the most promising one at the moment is the Oxford group, who I think are starting to enrol people both in England, Brazil and South Africa. But that'll take months before we get enough data in and then analyse it again. So I think the earliest we're going to get a vaccine that may be effective is, halfway through next year, and probably more realistic at the end of next year, because not only you have to prove it's safe, you've then got to produce millions of doses, if not billions of doses, if you really want to make a big impact. So it's quite a while. And, already people are having second lockdowns, for instance, in Melbourne, and that is a problem for how long you can do it and, how successful it's going to be as well.
Now, when you said you think it could be rolled out, everything going well, as early as mid-next year, end of the year, when you say that, do you mean, rolled out in the country which develops it, or are you rolled out also in Australia?
Well, I was hoping Australia, because I would presume we might have a licence from somebody and be able to produce it, for instance, at the CSL facilities or other facilities in Australia. But, this is a big ask. That's, I think, the best timeline. If we find it's some other vaccine that's pretty good, then we might find other countries monopolise it first. I mean, people will inevitably say, hey, I'm more important if I'm in the US than Australia is, or in China or wherever, you might have a good vaccine. So, realistically, it's going to be a few years at least, even if we come up with one or two good vaccines, and by that I mean 90% effective, before the whole of the world gets it. Admittedly, people with money, such as Australia, will probably be, further up the queue than countries that haven't got money. But this is a problem for all of us until we get widespread vaccination of an effective and safe vaccine across most of the world's community.
Now, on that point about, sharing it, I noticed that the Russians have put very little trial data, or none, released none, have been very secretive about a lot of what they're doing. Does this suggest to you that if the vaccine does work, Russia wants to keep it to itself?
Well, it might, but if you have to go between a conspiracy and a screw-up, I'd go for the screw-up every time. I think the reality is I don't think they've tested this on many people. I mean, I noticed Putin offered his daughter, but not himself, for testing. But that aside, I doubt that they've got much data. So I think this is more a publicity stunt than any real science to show, hey, we're the first in the world, but with minimal data. I mean, and, you know, it is important what data is available is made public, but I actually suspect they don't have a lot.
I don't know, Peter. I'm usually a fan like you of the thing, you know, so screw up before conspiracy. But we are talking about Vladimir Putin. Suddenly, for me, it just sort of swaps the other way around. Now, listen, you warned a couple of interviews ago that this virus would get worse in winter. It has. That's happened particularly in Victoria. But apart from winter coming, why is it so bad in Victoria from your perspective? I know you're not here, but why does it seem to be so bad in Victoria and just about under control or no problem really at all anywhere else in the country?
Well, there may be a number of factors. I mean, everybody else in Australia actually always thinks Melbourne weather is colder in winter. So that may be a factor because it may put people closer indoors, you know, in crowded situations. So, you know, whenever you're indoors, whether it's winter or perversely in summer in the southern US states, I suspect that's a big factor. You know, when you're not outside as much because it's too hot, or whether it's winter and you've got to be inside, that's a factor. But there are a number of things we need to do better as time goes on because we've got an ongoing problem. I mean, one obviously is the quarantine hotels. If what's reported in the media is true, that the genomics suggests it is from that hotels, that obviously is a big factor, and we've got to do that better everywhere around Australia and not have what happened in Victoria, because we have to have returning Australians. We can't, you know, say if you're an Australian, you can't go back to Australia for maybe 3 years or something. So we've got to do that better. I think another issue is I think there's been more transparency a bit in New South Wales than in Victoria. At least when they have an outbreak somewhere, be it a restaurant, you know, they're named and people know if they've been there. At least from what I can see, even the Cedar Meat Works in Victoria, there was a real reticency to name it. I think that makes it harder to follow up people who might have been in contact. I think another issue is, at least I understand from the media, I don't know whether it's true, but New South Wales, for instance, has had a lot more contact traces and been more aggressive at being able to do that. I think another issue is if it truly is a quarter of people who've got 100% of infection were not home when the ADF knocked on their doors, that's a major issue, that you have people who should have been...
Just don't get me started. When you hear a stat like this, it just knocks me over. I think, how can you not get something so basic right? I mean, it's just so obvious. It's beyond comprehension how that could happen. Just quickly, finally, Peter, the news from New Zealand that after more than 100 days, this virus is back, has hit 5 people. What does that tell you?
Well, look, I was always a bit concerned about this elimination term because I think that's very difficult to both get, but more important to sustain. One of the problems is that people who are young, 20s and 30s, they have minimal or no symptoms often. And so in my mind, it's easy to percolate below the surface for quite a long period of time, and then you get the right opportunity, it comes back. Now, I think they're worrying about frozen food or whatever, and I guess genomics will answer that. But, you know, I think it's inevitable that until we get an effective vaccine, even if you've got little or no virus, you've got to assume it's there, and you can't go back to what we were doing a year ago. And I think that pertains to a lot of areas in Australia as well. Effectively, Canberra, Perth, Adelaide, even Brisbane have got elimination by the definition. But I would be very wary about using that term. I prefer the term we've maintained very low level suppression, because that actually tells everybody we've still got to keep on our guard.
Peter Collignon, always great to talk to you. Thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you.